They called her Grandma behind her back. Sometimes, when he was feeling particularly cruel, Dr. Preston Sterling would call her that to her face, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was sharper than any scalpel. He had a running bet with the other residents, a crisp $50 bill tucked into the band of his gleaming Rolex, that the old nurse, Sarah Miller, wouldn't last a month at Metropolitan Trauma Center. She was too slow, he'd say, loudly enough for the whole nursing station to hear. Her hands had a faint, rhythmic tremor, a fatal flaw in a world that demanded absolute steadiness. She looked more like a librarian who had taken a wrong turn than a trauma nurse. The security camera footage, the same footage that would later be dissected by federal investigators and broadcast on every major news network, captured the exact moment her life was supposed to be over. 1 second she was just Sarah Miller, a fired, disgraced nurse standing under a flimsy bus stop shelter in a torrential October downpour, clutching a soggy cardboard box that held the sad remnants of a 20-year career. The next, the very fabric of the city night was torn apart by a sound that didn't belong there, a percussive, ground-shaking thwop, thwop, thwop that rattled the glass of the shelter and sent a vortex of wind and rain swirling around her. She looked up, her graying hair plastered to her forehead, and saw the impossible. A Black Hawk helicopter, its landing lights cutting through the deluge, descending with terrifying precision into the middle of the street. They took her ID badge, her stethoscope, and her dignity, handed her that cardboard box, and told her she was finished. After a lifetime spent in the chaotic crucible of saving lives, from the dust-choked fields of Kandahar to the sterile tile of this very hospital, Sarah Miller was accused of gross insubordination, reckless endangerment, and assault on an attending physician. She thought her life, the quiet, anonymous life she had fought so hard to build, was over. She was wrong. A 4-star general would later stand in the gleaming lobby of that same hospital, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of reporters and staff. He would hold up a single classified file and ask a question that would shatter Dr. Preston Sterling's world. "You fired her," the general said, his voice a low rumble of cold fury. "You fired the one person on this continent I would trust with my own life. You don't want a doctor, you want a medic, and you just threw the best damn one this country has ever produced out into the rain." This is the story of that moment. It's the story of how a woman they saw as a relic became a legend. It's the story of the day the cavalry came not for a soldier, but for a nurse. The simmering injustice of Metropolitan Trauma Center's emergency department was a low-grade fever that never broke. It was a culture cultivated and perfected by Dr. Preston Sterling, the chief surgical resident whose jawline was as sharp as his tongue and whose ego took up more physical space than the new MRI machine. He was the son of a senator, a fact he dropped into conversation with the subtlety of a dropped bedpan. His education was from Harvard, his suits were Italian, and his contempt for the nursing staff was boundless. He moved through the trauma bays not like a healer, but like a prince touring a particularly disappointing part of his kingdom. Sarah Miller had been there for 3 weeks. She'd taken the job for the pension, for the quiet routine she craved after decades where routine did not exist. She wanted to fade into the background, to be the competent, quiet nurse in oversized scrubs who did her job and went home. But to Sterling, her quietness was weakness. Her deliberate pace, a habit born from environments where a single misstep meant a secondary IED, was incompetence. Her age, early 50s, but worn by a life he couldn't possibly imagine, was a liability. Her hands were his favorite target. They had a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, the ghost of an old injury. "Miller, restock the pediatric crash cart," he barked one Friday night, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. The ER was in a momentary lull, a tense quiet before the city's weekend mayhem would inevitably spill through its doors. "I just did, doctor," Sarah replied, her voice quiet, almost raspy. Sterling leaned against the counter, folding his arms. He raised his voice, pitching it for the benefit of Brittany Moore, a young nurse who orbited him like a star-struck moon, and a few smirking residents. And you check the expiration dates. Every single ampule. We can't have a child dying of anaphylaxis because Grandma forgot to read the fine print. A wave of quiet laughter rippled through the onlookers. Brittany giggled, covering her mouth with a perfectly manicured hand. Sarah felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of anger she had learned to swallow down like a bitter pill. She didn't respond. She just turned, her movements slow and measured, and walked back to the pediatric cart. She pulled out the tray, her hands moving with methodical grace, and began checking the dates again, holding each vial up to the harsh fluorescent light. The tremor was a little more pronounced now, a traitorous little dance of her fingertips. Sterling watched her, a smug smirk playing on his lips. He was establishing dominance, reminding everyone of the hierarchy. He was the doctor, she was the nurse. He was young and powerful. She was old and disposable. Brenda Harrison, the charge nurse, watched the exchange from her desk. Brenda was a veteran of the ER wars, a woman in her 50s with arms like a dock worker and a stare that could curdle milk. She'd seen a dozen Sterling types come and go. She initially saw Sarah as Sterling did, too slow, too quiet, maybe past her prime. She didn't like Sterling's cruelty, but she didn't intervene. In the brutal ecosystem of the hospital, you picked your battles. Defending the new, quiet nurse wasn't a hill worth dying on. Not yet. Later that shift, a multi-car pileup on the interstate flooded the ER. The controlled chaos was Sterling's stage. He strode from bay to bay, shouting orders, performing for his audience. In Trauma Bay 3, a man with a flailed chest was struggling to breathe.
"Let's get a chest tube tray," Sterling commanded, palpating the man's ribs.
"Doctor," Sarah said from the other side of the gurney, "if we elevate his head and have him splint the injury, it might improve his ventilation enough to stabilize him before we have to tube him." It was a basic, effective maneuver, something to buy them precious time. Sterling didn't even look at her. He waved a dismissive hand. "Don't tell me how to do my job, nurse. This isn't some backwoods clinic. We follow protocol here. Get me the tray." He turned to a resident. "See? This is what happens when you let them think. Stick to the charts, Miller. It's safer for everyone." Sarah fell silent. She retrieved the tray, her face an unreadable mask. Inside, a storm was raging. She remembered teaching that exact technique to a terrified young medic in a dusty tent in Helmand Province, using a rolled-up uniform to splint a ranger's shattered chest while mortar fire rained down outside. Here, in this temple of modern medicine, that hard-won knowledge was dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman. She clenched her jaw and focused on the patient's vitals, her professionalism a shield against the sting of humiliation. She needed this job. She just had to endure. Big Mike Cogan, the head of security, saw it all from his post near the entrance. He was a mountain of a man, a former college football player now in his 60s, with a gentle demeanor that belied his size. He saw the way Sterling treated the nurses, especially Sarah. He'd made a point to learn her name, to ask her how her day was going. He saw the quiet dignity with which she absorbed the abuse, and it bothered him. He knew strength when he saw it, and it didn't always come in a loud, arrogant package. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was patient. Sometimes it was just waiting for its moment. If you're already hooked by this story of justice, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Now, back to Sarah's story, because what happened next changed everything. The moment arrived at 10:15 p.m. on a Saturday night, soaked in a freezing, miserable rain. The lull in the ER had stretched into an eerie calm, the kind that always preceded a storm. Sterling was holding court at the nursing station, bragging about a yacht trip he was planning. Brittany was hanging on his every word. Brenda was finishing up paperwork, her jaw tight. Sarah was in the supply closet, methodically restocking saline bags, the repetitive motion a small comfort. The alarm didn't just ring, it screamed. A piercing, continuous klaxon that cut through the low hum of the hospital. It wasn't a code blue for a cardiac arrest, or a code red for a fire. It was a sound few of them had ever heard outside of a drill.
Code black. Brenda's voice crackled over the intercom, stripped of its usual gruffness, replaced by a raw urgency.
Code black. ETA 2 minutes. All hands to the main trauma bay. This is not a drill. The atmosphere in the emergency department shifted instantly. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. Not the familiar pressure of a bad Saturday night, but the sharp, metallic taste of fear. Residents scrambled. Nurses rushed to their stations. The casual chatter died, replaced by the squeak of running shoes on linoleum and the clang of equipment being prepared. Sterling, for the first time, looked uncertain. His smirk vanished. Code black? What the hell is that? He muttered to a resident. Military or federal VIP, the resident whispered back, his face pale. Hospital lockdown. As if on cue, the glass doors at the ambulance bay didn't slide open. They burst open. 2 paramedics, their faces grim and splattered with rain and something darker, wheeled in a gurney at a dead run. Flanking them were 4 men who did not belong in a hospital. They were dressed in black tactical gear, rifles held in a low ready position, their eyes scanning every corner of the room with a cold, professional alertness that made the hospital security guards look like mall cops. They were military police, and they moved with the lethal grace of predators. On the gurney was a man who looked like he was carved from granite. Even under the blood and the chaos, his physique was that of an elite athlete, a warrior. He was unconscious, his breathing a horrifying, gurgling struggle. Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. Massive blood loss in the field. We've pushed 4 units of O negative. BP is 60 over palp, pulse thready at 140, the lead paramedic yelled, his voice raw. He's got shrapnel to the right side of his neck. We can't control the bleeding. Sterling snapped out of his stupor. This was the ultimate stage. A VIP, military brass, a gallery of witnesses. He puffed out his chest and strode forward, the arrogant prince reclaiming his throne. I'm Dr. Sterling, chief resident. This is my bay. Get him into Trauma 1. Let's get a central line, type and cross for 10 units and get surgery on the phone now. I want a full trauma panel and a portable chest x-ray. He pushed his way to the gurney, his eyes immediately locking onto the most dramatic injury. The ragged gash on the man's neck. It was bleeding profusely, painting the white sheets a brilliant, horrifying crimson. To a textbook-trained doctor, it was the obvious, immediate threat. He grabbed a handful of gauze and pressed down hard. Apply pressure. We need to stop this bleed before he strokes out, he commanded. The team swarmed the patient, a whirlwind of blue scrubs and focused activity. They cut away the man's tactical vest and clothing, revealing the brutal extent of his injuries. Sarah, drawn from the supply closet by the alarm, stood near the back. Her role to anticipate needs, to fetch supplies, to be an extra set of hands. She watched the scene unfold, her mind a calm, analytical machine. But as she watched, a cold dread began to creep up her spine. Everyone was focused on the neck, on the dramatic arterial spray that Sterling was so theatrically trying to control. But Sarah saw what they were missing. Her eyes, trained by years of battlefield triage, where the deadliest killer was often the quietest, noticed the subtle, terrifying signs. The man's neck veins were distended, bulging like thick cords against his skin. His trachea, the windpipe that should have been perfectly centered, was visibly shifted to the left, a deviation of at least 3 centimeters. And when a nurse tried to listen to his breath sounds, Sarah saw the nurse frown, tapping her stethoscope, listening again.
She knew what the nurse was hearing. Nothing. On the right side of his chest, there was only silence. It was a tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung from one of the bullet wounds was pumping air into his chest cavity with every ragged breath, crushing his good lung, his heart, his great vessels. The blood pouring from his neck was a distraction. This was the killer. He wasn't dying from blood loss. He was suffocating from the inside out. He had seconds, not minutes. The patient's monitor confirmed her diagnosis. The oxygen saturation number, already dangerously low, began to plummet. 78, 75, 70. The alarm shrieked a high-pitched, desperate warning. The man's lips, already pale, were turning a dusky, terrifying shade of violet. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it was clear and sharp, with an authority that made several people pause. "Dr. Sterling." Sterling didn't look up from the bleeding neck wound. "What is it, Miller? Can't you see I'm busy? Get me more lap pads." "His trachea is deviated," she said, stepping forward. "He has no breath sounds on the right. It's a tension pneumo. You have to decompress his chest. Now." Sterling finally looked at her, his face a mask of incandescent rage. To be questioned by her, in front of this audience of MPs and his own staff, was an unforgivable sin. "Get back," he snarled, his voice cracking with fury. "I am the physician in charge. I am handling the primary bleed. Are you blind? Don't you dare question my judgment in my trauma bay." He took a step toward her, using his larger frame to physically block her, to intimidate her back into her place. "One more word and you're fired. I swear to God." The monitor shrieked again. 65, 62. The patient's body gave a violent, convulsive shudder, and then his eyes rolled back into his head. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor began to slow, the rhythm stretching out into the long, terrifying spaces of impending death. Bradycardia. His heart was giving up. Sarah looked at Sterling. His confident facade had shattered. He was frozen, his eyes wide with panic, staring at the monitor as if he could will the numbers to go back up. He was a textbook doctor who had just run out of pages. He was lost. Then she looked at the dying man on the table. In that split second, her entire life coalesced. The faces of the boys she couldn't save in Fallujah. The promise she made to her late husband to leave the service, but to never stop healing. The oath she took, not to a hospital administrator or an arrogant resident, but to the patient. The career she was trying to protect, the quiet life she craved, her pension, it all turned to ash. There was only the man on the table and the ticking clock in his chest. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't say another word. She moved. It wasn't the slow, plotting shuffle of the nurse they called Grandma. It was an explosion of purpose. A lifetime of combat medicine compressed into a single fluid motion. She didn't run around Sterling. She moved through him. She dipped her left shoulder, planting her elbow firmly in his sternum. It wasn't a push. It was a tactical block. A move designed to create space with maximum efficiency and surprise. Sterling stumbled backward, gasping, a look of pure shock on his face. In the same motion, her right hand shot out to the intubation tray, bypassing the neatly arranged instruments and snatching a 14-gauge angiocath, a long, thick needle. Her eyes were locked on the patient's chest. She placed the palm of her left hand on his ribs, her fingers automatically finding the landmark she could feel in her sleep. The clavicle, the sternal notch. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Right there. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess. It was a motion she had performed 1,000 times in the back of bucking helicopters, in muddy ditches under a hail of gunfire, with nothing but a sliver of moonlight to see by. She plunged the needle into his chest. There was a sound audible throughout the now deathly silent trauma bay. A distinct, shocking hiss. It was the sound of trapped air, of a pound per square inch of deadly pressure escaping the prison of the man's chest cavity. The effect was immediate and miraculous. The patient's body arched off the gurney as he took a huge, shuddering gasp of air. The violet color vanished from his lips, replaced by a wave of healthy pink. On the monitor, the oxygen saturation number, which had bottomed out at 58, jumped. 70, 85, 92, 98. The slowing heart rate reversed, picking up from a deathly 40 beats per minute to a steady, life-affirming 80. His chest, which had been rising asymmetrically, now rose and fell in a beautiful, even rhythm. The room was frozen. The frantic energy had vanished, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. The residents, the nurses, even the hardened MPs, everyone was staring at the small, greying nurse who stood by the gurney, her hands still resting on the patient's chest, the orange hub of the catheter stark against his skin. The patient's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and shock, but they were lucid. His gaze swept past the stunned face of Dr. Sterling, past the other nurses, past the soldiers who were his brothers in arms. His eyes found Sarah. They locked onto her. A flicker of recognition, of disbelief, crossed his features. His hand, shaking with effort, lifted from the gurney. He didn't reach for an MP. He didn't reach for a doctor. He reached for her, his fingers weakly closing around the sleeve of her oversized scrubs, gripping the fabric like a lifeline. Through the clear plastic of his oxygen mask, he whispered a single, raspy word. A name. A call sign. A legend, whispered in the darkest corners of the special operations world. Dusty. The lead MP, a sergeant major whose face was a roadmap of hard-won battles, stiffened as if struck by lightning. His eyes snapped from his commander to Sarah, widening in absolute shock. The other MPs exchanged stunned glances. They knew that name. Every operator knew that name. It was a ghost story told around campfires in Afghanistan. A myth of a medic who could walk through fire and bring men back from the dead. They just never expected the ghost to be a 50-something nurse in a civilian hospital. Sarah looked down at the commander, her face calm, but her eyes held a deep, ancient weariness. She gently patted his hand. "At ease, Commander," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let us work." Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling. Because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. The spell broke. The first to recover was Preston Sterling. His shock curdled into pure, unadulterated fury. The humiliation was absolute. She hadn't just disobeyed him. She had shown him up, proven him catastrophically wrong in front of everyone. She had saved a man's life by assaulting him. "Security!" he shrieked, his voice a high-pitched, ugly thing. "Get her out of here! She assaulted me! She performed an unauthorized procedure! She could have killed him! Get her away from my patient!" Two hospital security guards, not Big Mike, started forward hesitantly. But they stopped dead when the MP Sergeant Major took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself between them and Sarah. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't have to. His glare was enough. "Nobody touches her," he said, his voice a low growl that promised violence. The guards froze. But the hospital had its own chain of command. 2 hours later, after the patient, a Navy SEAL commander named Mark Allen, was stabilized and whisked away to a secure military wing of the hospital, Sarah found herself in a plush conference room on the administrative floor. The air was cold, the mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, and the leather chairs squeaked with self-importance. Across from her sat Harold Henderson, the hospital administrator, a man who sweated profusely even in a climate-controlled room, and whose primary concern was always liability. Beside him, in a fresh white coat, sat a composed Dr. Sterling, his victimhood practiced and polished. A stone-faced woman from Human Resources held a file. "Miss Miller," Henderson began, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "We have a very serious situation here." Sterling leaned forward. "She attacked me, Harold, in the middle of a resuscitation. She was unstable, hysterical. I was managing a critical neck bleed following established ATLS protocol when she lost control and assaulted me, then performed a blind, reckless procedure that could have punctured his heart. It was a masterful lie, constructed to paint her as the villain and him as the calm professional who had to clean up her mess." The HR director opened her file and began to read in a cold monotone. "The charges are as follows: gross misconduct and insubordination, physical assault on an attending physician, performing an unauthorized medical procedure, and reckless endangerment." Sarah sat perfectly still. She looked at her hands, which were resting in her lap. The tremor was back, a fine vibration born of adrenaline and exhaustion. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. What was the point? They had already made their decision. "The patient is stable, isn't he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Thanks to my intervention after her episode," Sterling cut in smoothly. "I was able to regain control of the situation and stabilize him." Henderson wrung his hands. "Due to the severity of these events and the potential for litigation, Sarah, we have to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Sarah just nodded. "Fine." She stood up, her small frame looking impossibly fragile in the cavernous room. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. She just looked at Sterling, her eyes clear and direct. "When you write your official report, will you tell them you saved him?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Sterling couldn't meet her gaze. Big Mike Cogan was tasked with escorting her out. He met her by the elevators, his broad face etched with misery. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he mumbled as they walked through the brightly lit corridors. "This isn't right. What you did in there, I've never seen anything like it." "Watch that blood pressure, Mike," she said, giving him a small, tired smile. "Don't let these people get to you." He handed her the standard-issue cardboard box for her personal effects. She packed her locker in silence. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's okayest nurse." A well-worn stethoscope she'd bought herself years ago. A small, dying, succulent plant. And a framed photo of her late husband, David, in his army dress uniform. He was smiling, his eyes proud. 2 decades of service, 2 decades of saving lives, all reduced to a box that wouldn't even fill the passenger seat of a car. As she walked through the ER for the last time, box in her arms, the other nurses wouldn't meet her eyes. They knew an injustice had occurred. They knew Sterling was a menace. But they also knew that if they spoke up, they would be next. Brittany Moore, however, watched her go, and for the first time, there was no giggle, no smirk. There was only a look of dawning horror and shame on her face. The automatic doors slid shut behind Sarah with a final, indifferent whoosh, sealing her off from the world she had just been expelled from. And then the rain began to fall. Not a drizzle, but a cold, driving deluge that soaked through her thin scrubs in seconds. Her car was in the shop, a repair she couldn't afford. She walked the 6 blocks to the bus stop, the weight of the box growing heavier with every step. The cardboard began to soften and sag, the corners drooping. She clutched it to her chest, trying to shield the photo of David from the water. She huddled under the plexiglass shelter, shivering. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked panels. Her bad knee, a souvenir from a hard landing in Kandahar, began to throb in a painful rhythm that matched the sweep of the windshield wipers on passing cars. It's over. The thought wasn't angry or sad. It was just a heavy, suffocating fact. They would report her to the nursing board. She would lose her license. No more healing. No more purpose. She'd end up as a greeter at a grocery store, a tired old woman with shaky hands that no one knew had once held life and death in their grasp. The quiet life she had dreamed of had been a fantasy. There was no peace for people like her. Her reflection in the dark glass was a stranger, a small, defeated old woman, hair plastered to her skull, clutching a pathetic, dissolving box. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she was just a relic, a ghost who didn't know her place in the modern world. That was when she heard it. A low, guttural thrumming that vibrated up through the soles of her shoes. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't traffic. It grew steadily, a deep, powerful beat that seemed to press against her chest. Thwop, 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 thwop. Puddles on the pavement began to ripple. The plexiglass of the bus shelter rattled in its frame. She looked up from her soggy box, peering into the rain-swept darkness. The clouds tore apart. Two brilliant white lights cut through the gloom, descending rapidly. The sound became a deafening roar, a physical force that inverted umbrellas a block away and sent trash cans rolling down the street. A Black Hawk helicopter, sleek and menacing and utterly out of place, was landing in the middle of the intersection, its rotor wash a miniature hurricane. Cars slammed on their brakes, the screech of tires lost in the engine's roar. Pedestrians scattered, screaming, assuming it was a terrorist attack. Before the helicopter's skids even touched the glistening asphalt, black SUVs were swarming the area, positioning themselves sideways to block all traffic. Their doors flew open, and soldiers, not MPs but operators in full combat gear, Delta or Rangers by the look of them, poured out, establishing a perimeter with a swift, brutal efficiency that spoke of countless real-world operations. The street was instantly awash in a blinding symphony of red, blue, and white flashing lights. From the lead SUV, a figure emerged. He was an older man, tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from oak. He used a simple wooden cane, but he didn't lean on it. He wielded it, holding it at his side like a marshal's baton. On the shoulders of his immaculate dress uniform, 4 silver stars gleamed in the chaotic light. He walked directly through the pouring rain, his gaze sweeping the scene with an air of absolute command. He didn't seem to notice the storm. It was as if the rain itself knew better than to touch him. One of the soldiers pointed a gloved finger towards the bus stop. "Target located, sir. In the rear." The 4-star general's eyes locked onto the small, drenched figure huddled in the shelter. He began to walk towards her, his polished shoes splashing through the puddles. Sarah stared, bewildered, her mind struggling to process the scene. Was she hallucinating? Was this some bizarre, stress-induced dream? The general stopped in front of her. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a mixture of relief, concern, and profound respect. "You're a hard woman to track down, Dusty," he said, his voice a calm, deep baritone that was perfectly audible even over the roar of the helicopter. Sarah's heart stopped. Dusty. No one had called her that in 10 years, not since she'd retired. Her cardboard box slipped from her numb fingers, spilling its contents onto the wet pavement. The framed photo of David landed face up in a puddle. "General Vance," she breathed, the name coming out as a shocked whisper. General Thomas Vance, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, bent down stiffly and retrieved the photo. He wiped the water from the glass with his thumb and handed it back to her.
"Hello, Sarah. You look like hell. We need to go."
"Go where?" she stammered.
"Back to the hospital," he said, his expression hardening. "I was watching a press conference. It seems we have a record to correct." They walked back into the lobby of Metropolitan Trauma Center, not as a general and a fired nurse, but as an unstoppable force. The soldiers cleared a path. The hospital staff stared, mouths agape. Harold Henderson and the PR team were in the middle of the lobby, where a smirking Dr. Sterling was standing at a podium, bathed in the light of news cameras, recounting his heroic version of the night's events. And while the situation was complicated by the interference of an unstable staff member, we were ultimately able to stabilize the patient. "A true American hero," Sterling was saying, his voice smooth and confident. "That's enough," General Vance's voice boomed, cutting through the lobby like a thunderclap. The cameras swiveled. The reporters gasped. Sterling froze mid-sentence, his face draining of all color. Vance walked directly to the podium, Sarah at his side. He ignored Sterling completely, addressing the cameras and the stunned crowd. "My name is General Thomas Vance. The man you have in your hospital, Commander Mark Allen, is not just a patient. He is the head of a SEAL team that just completed a critical national security mission. I was monitoring his extraction. I have also been monitoring your hospital's internal security feeds for the last 3 hours." He turned his icy gaze on Sterling. "Dr. Sterling, you just told the nation that this woman," he gestured to Sarah, "was fired for instability and incompetence." Sterling swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "General, with all due respect, she was a danger to the patient. She assaulted me." Vance held up a hand, silencing him. He turned to an aide, who handed him a slim, black folder stamped with classified markings. "Do you know who Sarah Miller is?" the general asked the silent room. He opened the folder. He didn't need to read from it. He knew it by heart. "Retired Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller, United States Army Medical Corps," he began, his voice ringing with pride and fury. "6 tours of duty, 3 in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan. Led trauma specialist, attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment, and later, Joint Special Operations Command. Recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry under fire, the Bronze Star with valor, and 2 Purple Hearts." A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda Harrison's eyes were wide as saucers. Brittany Moore had both hands clapped over her mouth. Big Mike stood by the door, a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. She's legendary in the Spec Ops community as Dusty, because she performed more successful surgical procedures in Black Hawk helicopters during dust-off evacuations than most surgeons perform in a sterile operating room in a year. Vance continued, his voice rising. "You want to talk about her shaky hands, Doctor? Those hands have a tremor because of nerve damage. Nerve damage she sustained holding direct pressure on a soldier's severed femoral artery for 6 consecutive hours in a downed helicopter, refusing evacuation for herself until every other wounded man was airlifted out. She saved 12 men that day. Her slowness, you mock? It's a shattered knee she got while shielding a wounded Marine from a mortar blast in Kandahar." Vance slammed the folder shut. He pulled out a tablet and held it up. On the screen, crystal clear security footage was playing. It showed Sterling focusing on the neck wound. It showed Sarah's warning. It showed Sterling shoving her. It showed the monitor flatlining. And it showed Sarah's explosive, precise, life-saving intervention. A first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch would have spotted that tension pneumothorax, Vance said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You were paralyzed by protocol and ego while a hero was dying on your table. When this woman attempted to save his life, you assaulted her." Sterling crumpled. The polished, arrogant veneer shattered, revealing the terrified, incompetent child beneath. He stammered, trying to form a defense, but no words came out. His senator father, his Harvard degree,
None of it could save him now. General Vance turned his withering gaze on the administrator, Harold Henderson, who was now sweating so much his shirt was translucent. "They told me you fired her. That ends now. This hospital and its billing practices are now under federal investigation for potential fraud and malpractice cover-ups, starting with your tenure." Henderson acted with the swift, desperate self-preservation of a cornered rat. He pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, a pre-written termination letter. "Dr. Sterling," he said, his voice trembling, "effective immediately, your privileges are suspended. The board has voted to terminate your contract pending the results of this investigation." He threw his golden boy completely and utterly under the bus. The final, perfect act of karmic justice was delivered not by the general, but by Big Mike. He stepped forward from the back of the crowd, holding an empty cardboard box. He walked right up to the podium and placed it in front of the shell-shocked Preston Sterling. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," Big Mike said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent lobby. "Here's a box for your things. It's a bit small, but I think you'll manage." As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Sterling, the arrogant prince, stumbled away from the podium. He took his box and began his own walk of shame, escorted out into the same pouring rain he had sent Sarah into just an hour before. No umbrella, no waiting limousine, no powerful father to call. Just a soggy box and a ruined life. 1 year later, the sun was shining brightly on the newly dedicated Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller Center for Trauma Excellence at Metropolitan. The entire culture of the hospital had been transformed. Nurses were empowered, protocols had been rewritten based on Sarah's real-world expertise, and patient mortality rates in the ER had dropped by 15%. Sarah, now the director of trauma operations, stood at a podium. She wasn't wearing scrubs, but a sharp professional suit. In the front row, General Vance sat smiling proudly. Beside him was Commander Mark Allen, looking healthy and strong, a faint scar on his neck the only reminder of that night. The new chief resident, a humble and brilliant young woman, watched Sarah with open admiration. "Authority isn't a title on a door," Sarah said to the assembled crowd. "It's the trust your patient places in you. Power isn't the ability to give orders, it's the ability to heal. This center is named for a nurse not because of one person, but as a promise that we will always listen, a promise that we will always put the patient first, and a promise that if you ever have to break a rule to save a life, you do it. I'll have your back." After the speech, a nervous young nurse, not much older than Brittany Moore had been, approached her. "Colonel Miller, ma'am, thank you. You have no idea what it means to us." Sarah looked at the young nurse's eager, uncertain face and saw a reflection of her younger self. She placed a hand on her shoulder. Her hand was perfectly steady. "Just protect your patients," she said, her voice warm and kind. "That's all that matters. The rest will take care of itself." The cycle of fear had been broken, replaced by a legacy of courage. The ghost of the battlefield had found her peace, not by hiding from the world, but by reshaping it in her own image. Competent, courageous, and uncompromisingly human. And that is the incredible true story of Sarah Dusty Miller. It's crazy to think that she was fired for saving a life just minutes before a 4-star general needed her to do exactly that. It really makes you wonder how many heroes are out there right now getting punished for doing the right thing just because it breaks a protocol. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life dramas about heroes getting the justice they deserve, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling me what you think should have happened to Dr. Sterling. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.